Narayan, 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 Narayan. Harihi Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Namaste everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Samvadaha series. Today I sat down with Viduleka Tiwari ji, whom I connected with a number of weeks ago, and we discovered that there are many topics that we are commonly interested in, on which we would like to build our perspectives, share our worldviews, and also allow the audience to have a peek into what a genuine, sincere, and engaging dialogue looks like. Today's episode is entitled Challenges Faced by Bharat, and I should say this is one of the most engaging conversations I've had in a very long time. The area that we covered was extremely broad, and this would serve as a springboard for future episodes to come. I hope you enjoyed as much as we did. I would also like to take an opportunity to elicit your feedback if you have any suggestions on future topics we could riff upon, and general comments. I would also like to apologize for the poor quality of video from my end. I'm in the process of receiving a new webcam, and hopefully things should get sorted in the next week or so. With that in mind, welcome once again to the first episode of Samvadaha. Harihi Om.
Hari Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Om Narayan, 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 Narayan. Background is I'm a student of Advaita Vedanta. My educational background is primarily in industrial engineering and systems engineering with economics as well. And my interest has been in the culture of Bharat has spanned for the last 10 years. This very closely coincided with the time I moved to the US and began to discover certain things about our nation that I hadn't really taken interest in earlier on. And so part of this series, hopefully, that this would be the first of several conversations that we will hold, would be to understand what are some of the challenges facing Bharat, look at it from a broader perspective, and then perhaps narrow into certain topics. So with that, I pass this over to Viduleka ji to share something about herself.
Namaste everyone. So I am Viduleka Tiwari and I have recently taken admission in PhD in urban and regional planning. And along with that, I have been interested in machine learning kind of subjects for my research. And when we talk about the other subjects, then I'd say that I am more interested in analyzing how and why the things are happening. I'm a curious person to be precise. So that makes me think about things, and thus we are here to discuss about how uh, spirituality, culture, tradition, and our society are interlinked and interacting with each other. So, as this is a general conversation or say a dialogue, so I like to start it by pointing out one of the major issues we face today, that is mental health problems. So, when I think about it, I think that every other person you meet, especially from our generation, the millennials generation, they are stuck in some of the issues, be it anxiety, be it depression, be it something similar or something minute. So when I talk to them, I realize that most probably they don't have someone to share their feelings with. They don't know how to put forward their own feelings, and they don't know how to listen. So it's the problem from both the sides. And according to me, the roots goes inside to the family structure because it has been disintegrating. So I like to ask Prashant Parekh what he wants to say about it.
So absolutely true that these mental health issues have been plaguing us for the last decade or so, and things have gone downhill significantly and very quickly. And it has a lot to do, as you said, very rightly pointed out, that slowly we moved away from the joint family structure where you had three generations living together. You had the child, you had the parents, and you had the grandparents. And in some cases, such as in my instance, when I was growing up, we also had my uncle and aunt and cousin. We were all together in the same house. And so there's an old saying that it takes a village to raise a child.
Hmm.
And perhaps we were not fortunate enough to be blessed by a village, but at least we had an extended family. And with modernity and with monetary success that a lot of people have found since the 1990s in India, People have opted to live separate lives. There used to be instances, I remember when I was a child, everybody in your building would get together. They would be playing cricket in the gully, in your compound. You would be sitting on your neighbor's cars. You'd be running away. You'd know everybody, and people's doors were open. But nowadays, you hardly know who your next door neighbor is. Forget people living above or below. And
Right.
so not only have our families become smaller, but we've also lost that touch with community. And nowadays, our heads are really stuck into our monitors as opposed to outside the window. And
Right.
so, I would take a pause on that, and perhaps Viduleka ji can share some more.
Yes, so when you are saying things like the effect of technology, then I like to point out one more thing. Like when I used to be in first to second year of my college, that is 2013, 14, those years. So smartphones was just coming into the market, and we did not have much access to WhatsApp and even sorry, phones or any social. The data was costly, so we did not used to get involved in phones so much, but still I used to listen from my friends that they don't want to live in a joint family. They don't want people from the society to interfere in what they are doing. So I thought about it for a lot of months, that what exactly is going on, why are they thinking like this. So what I realized was uh, the uh, the responsibility of a society is to make a person, to produce a person. Every single person you see is the product of his surroundings. But you see, nowadays people are so disintegrated at a spiritual and mental level. They do not connect with each other. So what they do is they point out small faults in every other person they see, and this further adds up to the disintegration part. So means it goes much back, like it's not just past 1 decade or 1.5 decade. I think it goes back to the time from 1960s or 70s, when the urbanization really started. What happened was, as I am also a student of urban regional planning, what I think, how I perceive it as, you see, cities were meant to be a node for business, and villages were meant for living. But somehow the policies formed in such a way that you were provided everything if you are living in a city. When I say that, I mean the infrastructure. But when you move towards village, they were being ignored. So people started moving towards city for living, and that caused a shift in the social structure, which wasn't healthy at all. So first of all, this disintegrated the culture of village and agriculture, which was a very self-sustainable practice. Over the time, it disintegrated our family structures, as when we were young and the generation 4 5 years older than us, they used to study about how pros and cons of nuclear families and joint families. So that somehow affected each one of us, and this continued forward. Like you see, now people are finding differences in everything. They are trying to find differences in colors, caste, even the genders. There are a range of genders, and they are not trying to uh, live together. What they are trying is, they are trying to find out the differences between them, which is disintegrating them more. So we are not working towards how to bring them all together. We are kind of stuck in working towards how to uh, means how to differentiate between each of them. So with that, I like to ask you, what's how can it be solved up? What do you think about it?
But that is absolutely true. So here I live in the US, though I spent the majority of my life in Bharat. And when my father was my age, they used to have a very, very, very large joint family, even larger than what we are typically used to.
Mm.
So there were cousins and cousin uncles and aunts and this and that. There were almost like 20 people living together under the same roof. So I asked my father a simple question that you had the means to live separately. It wasn't a matter of financial constraints. So what prompted you all to stay together in such a cramped space? And so he said, when the heart is big, you don't worry about finding space for yourself.
Right.
And I always found that to be very beautiful. And so, here, especially this, I will draw a lot of parallels between the US and India.
Mm.
And the reason is that usually the bad trends that start in the US, they start getting transferred over to India as well. People begin to
Mhm.
adopt those.
Yeah.
So in US, there's something called my private space. So, you are in my space. Stop breathing my oxygen. Give me that room that I need. And even the culture over here, if you don't stand like 6 feet or 5 feet apart from somebody else and you even get a little close, it seems like an invasion of privacy to a lot of people.
Mhm.
And so more and more we've become individualized and we've started creating a bubble for ourselves. And we are not letting other people in, which is extremely poor for our mental health, as you said. And yes, it's true that the deterioration started several generations ago, especially with urbanization. And I would also add that this deterioration has a quickened pace with the advent of the internet.
Yes.
Because earlier we used to meet people at cafes, and then
Hmm.
it became cyber cafes. And now it's not even cyber cafes. Now it's in a tiny little room sitting somewhere, and you pretend that you enjoy a relationship with 1,500, 2,000 people on Facebook or Twitter or wherever. And maybe just a select few are your friends. But this is something that just to give our viewers some context, Vidulekha ji and I had a very extended and animated discussion 2 days ago, which was one of the most engaging discussions I've had with somebody. And even prior to that, we spoke a little bit on Facebook about how social media turns you into a personality that you try to project as opposed to the real person that you are. And so, if you have real friends, if you go to school with them, if you attended college with them, if you're at the workplace with them, they can see your face, they can see your emotions, they can see the lines and the creases on your forehead, and they know something's going on. They are able to relate to you as a real person. They know that you have your ups and downs in life, and you are very open in sharing it with these flesh and blood creatures that surround you. But on the internet, we always put our best foot forward. Our profile pictures will always show 32 pearly whites, and you'll have a broad beaming smile and a picture perfect family, and everything will be ideal. And so what that ends up doing is three things, I would argue. That first is we create a split in our own minds about who we actually are and what we are trying to project. The second thing is that also inhibits us from sharing our real concerns, because somehow we feel that if I were to say something is not well in my life, people would judge me. And that would drive my insecurity further. And that would also prevent people from reaching out to me. And the third cost is actually a social cost, not an individual cost. Because, as we were growing up, sometimes, like, if things are not well, or if you are complaining to your parents as a child, they would say, see, look at these, there are so many poor people who don't even have food to eat, and you are complaining about eating your sabji. Like, there are people who don't have the means to even fend for themselves. And you will always point at somebody who is worse off than you to make yourself feel better. And that's not a good approach. But as a child, it works. When you're a child, they'll banao your file, basically. But now what happens is when you log in to your profiles and you look at everybody around you doing so exceptionally well, and they are so perfect in their own way, and then you begin to look at yourself and you start feeling that you are unaccomplished, you have failed, you have somehow not met the goals of life that you were supposed to. And so while this change and movement towards depression had started, as you pointed out, with urbanization, it has been further layered and quickened with the advent of internet and especially the social media syndrome.
Yes, right. And with this, I like to go back to the family wala point. So what I was thinking is when it again comes back to the parenting part, like how our generation had been raised, how our parents' generation was raised, and before that means these two are separate, and before that it was different. So what I think is, like you see, earlier what used to happen that if a mother is getting angry on a small kid, then there will be some nani or dadi in the background who will call that kid and put the kid in their laps and console them. But now what happens is the mother scolds the the kid goes in their room and he cries, he stops, he gets back by himself. So
Hmm.
what is happening, according to me, is there was a whole emotional balance going on when we used to live in uh, joint families. But now it's different. Now the kid whose psychology, child psychology is a whole different subject. So the psychology of a child is different. Someone shouting on me at my age, I'll perceive it very differently from someone, means when I how I used to perceive it when I used to be a kid. So such things, such small things, and parents are not able to understand it because they have come out of that whole environment, say system of families, and now our generation is facing the consequences. And the worst part is they are not even able to communicate about it because we don't know much about it, and the older generation doesn't know anything about it. So it has become a very difficult situation. And as you rightly pointed out, the technology has added up several layers to it, because it makes me very sad to not able to see kids on the roads, because 10 years ago when I used to be in school, we had our time decided. The whole means the kids from the whole colony, we used to play on the terraces, and we used to play kabaddi, girls versus boys. Whole colony was playing kabaddi, and the team was not segregated on the basis of age or anything. Somehow coincidentally the numbers and the ages were balanced among boys and girls, so it used to be our favorite games. But now I don't see kids outside. And this reminds me of this thing I read a few days ago on internet. It was basically meant for men, the males, that they are deprived. So you see, that's a very very basic need for a human being to be touched, to be hugged, but they are lacking that. Means it is as essential as food, but since it doesn't show its effects right then, we keep on ignoring it until it's too late. People realize that they are so alone. Things like that are happening.
That's an excellent point. So I want to take that idea that you mentioned about the touch that's required for a child growing up, because this has become a pandemic. Okay. Today, what happens is you've replaced mother's milk with bottled milk. And when a child, especially a newborn, is deprived of that mother's touch because mothers and fathers both go off to work, and then maybe you have a nanny at home, or maybe the mother just leaves a bottle behind and somebody in the family will just basically give the child bottled milk. That also deprives a lot of touch in the initial years, and the child actually craves that mother's nurturing touch. So even since my daughter, she's 2 years old, and I've sort of been through these development phases. The position that a child takes up in the womb is very comfortable because it's nicely snuggled, and it's comforted, and there's a warm, secure environment. And the first thing that you do once the child is born and bathed and cleaned and all of that, you put it in a swaddle, because it wants to be in that same swaddled womb-like comfortable environment where it still feels that it has enough space to just be with itself and then be with the mother, and there's nobody else it wants to be with at that point. And so I would also argue that what's happening in the West over here is, one day I went to work, and so we had a team conference, and somebody asked me a question which I thought was very silly, that when do you give milk to your child? And I said, like, first I was taken aback for a moment. I'm like, wait, I thought there's a difference in genders. But then they said, no, we meant like, when do you give bottled milk? I'm like, we don't use bottled milk. The mother belongs with the child during these initial stages of development, and a lot of psychological ailments begin between the age of 0 to 4. In fact, it is said that your personality, your core personality, develops by the age of 6, and your socialization skills develop by the age of 4. If by 4 you're not socialized, you're going to carry those emotional scars for the rest of your life. And they will take the form of different phobias and different insecurity issues, trust issues, so on and so forth. And so I really like that point that you raised, that, boys, girls, children in general require a warm, caring, motherly, fatherly touch. And the more away you are from your homes, like especially in the last few decades now, there has been a shift in gender roles as well. And understandably, we cannot argue with too many things, but we have to see the pros and cons of both. So with both parents going to work, who is really there with the child if you don't have a joint family? Your parents are also not there. Your grandparents are also not there. Perhaps you're sent off to daycare, or maybe you're sent off to play school, or maybe you're hiring some nanny who's not really your relative or your parent or whoever, and so they are doing it for the money. It's a job, and so you cannot expect the same love, care, and affection out of everybody as you can from your immediate family. So again, going to your original point, also this disintegration has taken many forms and it has many ailments associated with it.
I see more aspects of it. As you were talking about child development and the stages and the ages. So I was reading how the emotional quotient or the emotional strength of a child is built up till they are 12 to 14 years of age. And that stuck in my mind that you see, we put the children in schools, and the age when they are supposed to develop that emotional strength and bonding, they are struggling towards competing with each other. Means how sad that is, that when you are required to learn how to emotionally connect with people, you are not connecting, you are not even being neutral, you are learning to be competitive. And I think that's one of the very critical reasons why we have not learned to listen or to speak about how we are feeling. And that makes me think that whether the Gurukul Parampara was good, because at that time children were sent to Gurukuls after 12 or 13 years of age, after the Upnayan and Sanskar. So that makes me think whether uh, I should suggest people to school home their kids or not, because I don't know how parents are going to react in the age of competition, but I don't think that schools really teach you something that is so extraordinary that which cannot be taught at home till you are in class sixth or say even eighth. If the both the parents are educated, then I don't think that a child needs to go to school till he or she reaches standard eighth or something like that.
Controversial, and I agree. Uh, Based on our last conversation when we spoke, I mentioned that I felt betrayed by the educational system, that they betrayed me as an individual. It stunted my growth because the years I should have spent exploring and learning about life and understanding how things work, I had to do that outside of the educational system, not within it. The four walls of the educational system did not offer me what I was looking for as part of my personal growth. And so, your point about perhaps being homeschooled, or even now, again, with everything, there's a pro and con. So initially, I sort of started off on a negative note about technology, but then technology has also offered us many solutions to learn things that we would not have otherwise access to. And so today, you can go to YouTube, you can find complete courses, not even like single classes, but the entire semester's worth of courses of whatever subject you're looking for, and you can study it at your own pace. And so there are many options available today that were not available earlier on. Now, as far as the competition goes, you're right. Today there's an overdrive in competition. A little competition is very healthy because that prepares you for your working life. When it inculcates elements of discipline, responsibility, that you need to get your stuff done on time, otherwise you will miss out on opportunities. So there is some merit to competition. And if you look at ancient times, let's just take the Mahabharata. So we do know that there was a friendly competition even between the Pandavas and the Kauravas while they were studying under Dronacharya, Astra Shastra. And after their education was complete, they had to compete with each other in a display. They had to shoot their arrows and display their archery skills. And so there were elements of that, but today we have taken it too far. That's the problem. That you are taught to compete from such a young age when you should actually be playing and exploring the world. Now, coming to the topic of playing, uh, when we were growing up in our generation, there was a lot of unstructured play. That your parents just told you, okay, after school, okay, go play with your friends in the building or in the gully, and you'll pretty much be doing what you wanted to do. One day it could be cricket, one day it could be kho, it could be kabaddi, it could be anything. Your parents didn't tell you what you should be doing in terms of your free play. But now that free play and unstructured play has been replaced with classes. So now if you want to play cricket, you'll have like classes for that. If you want to play table tennis, you'll have classes for that. For tennis, you'll have classes. For everything that you do, you have classes. And so part of the child's mind, in order for it to develop well, it requires a little bit of unstructured play and not only structured class after class after class, because that doesn't allow the imagination to thrive. And sometimes you might get into something because you've been told to do that, as opposed to exploring what your gifts truly are.
Right. So means that reminds me of incidents that happened. So I went to the home of this particular person I know, and his daughter was studying in class 9, and he was very worried that she is not means we are unable to find out what she is interested in and what she is going to do in future. So I said that she studies in a very rich, classy kind of school. So first of all, bring her out of that school and put her in a small sarkari or some kind of that kind of school. My logic was that when you study in small schools, right, uh, you learn decision making, as you are talking about free play. So when you are in a free play, you learn that decision making skill. But when you are in a whole set up nice environment, you don't learn how to decide for yourself. You don't learn to find out what you are interested in, and that is showing up in the Gen Z kids. You talk to them, if you start a nice conversation like what did you do in the last lockdown, they will surely start some topic like I did drawing. But when you go on, uh, they get stuck at a point. But same thing, when if someone would have asked from our generation of kids, means people used to ask her what did we study. They did not used to ask us what did we draw. Just in case they asked us, we would have uh, at least I would have spoken about it for half an hour at least. I had so much of matter because we used to think and we used to create and we used to uh, decide. It was upon us. Means at least 20% of life, minimum 20% of our lives was decided by us. Second point I was thinking about it is uh, as you were talking about competition and such things and why you were not happy with the education system. So here I would like to say that even I was not happy. I am not happy with the education system. But there's this one thing which keeps me going and kept me going through several things. So as I stated earlier, I am a curious person. I question everything. So I remember in 2008, I was in class 8. So I asked my father that why are we doing what are we doing? Means I used to have questions like why being thief is not a good thing. Thief is also doing some mehnat for getting his food. So that is also mehnat. And the person whose belongings is getting stolen, he should have been careful. So he explained me that why it is not ethical, because you cannot uh, bother anyone else for getting your own food. So this one point. Second point was, I asked that why are we required to do something? Means why am I required to get a job? Why am I required to uh, help people? So he told me that when a person is born, everything that he is provided by the society and the mother earth. Means every single thing that we are, be it good or bad, if we are alive, then it is being provided by the society, and hence it becomes our responsibility to pay that back. And honestly, you cannot pay anyone back for, means you cannot pay them enough for keeping you alive. Means I am 23 years old. I won't be able to pay back in next 2-3 janmas if that happens for this one single life, because I cannot single-handedly make a person. That is not possible at all. So that kept me driving that, oh yes, I am here because of the resources and because of the help I have been getting, and thus I need to pay it back. And that kept me going. Like this is my motive of the life, and thus I should go on. And this reminds me of the rin we talk about in Hindu, what do you say, not philosophy,
Teachings.
replace that with the right kind of word. So I like to continue with that.
That's wonderful. In fact, even on that note, our Shastra teaches the very same thing, that you have this rana, this debt to pay, and there are 5 debts to pay, which can be paid off by the Pancha Maha Yajnas. So these are the 5 great yajnas that every human being is supposed to engage in. So of course you have Pitru Yajna for the sake of your parents and your ancestors, because they are the ones who brought you into this world. And then you have Bhuta Yajna, which is for the sake of the environment, the resources, the ecology, the plants and the animals and Mother Earth in general. That every last cell in your body is nourished by Mother Earth and the air that you breathe and the water that you drink and the surroundings that nurture you. And so we have a debt to pay the environment within which we symbiotically coexist. And then you have a debt to pay towards your fellow human beings. So that's Manushya Yajna, where, as you said, that society is what keeps you alive. And you have an infrastructure, you have a roof over your head, you have food to eat, you have the transportation system, you have so many things that we take for granted, but they are all responsible for keeping us where we are. And so that becomes Manushya Yajna. And then you have Brahma Yajna, that we have the great rishis and the great Mahatmas who have passed down these teachings through time immemorial. And our duty is to ensure that they stay alive for the forthcoming generations as well. And that way you also have Dev Yajna, that my guru used to say that a lot of people are proud of the fact that they are self-made men or self-made women. They use that expression that I'm self-made. And he says, what is self-made? Is your liver cell made by you? Is your, are your neurons made by you? Is anything about you truly your own product? You're a product of your environment. How can you say that you are self-made? This also goes back into our free will discussion a little bit to some extent, that everything that you are right now is a consequence of your past. And there is a past beyond this life that you cannot even access in terms of your understanding of where you were and what you were and what you were doing then and what actions led you to being where you are today. And so you cannot say that you are a self-made person even starting from the womb, because that process has been flowing from previous janmas anyway that have brought you here based on your own karmas. So what part of you truly is accomplished as an individual? None of it, if you really think about it. It's all a process flow. And therefore, when we think about our existence as limited creatures, not as the Atma, but as limited creatures, we begin to see that there is so much to be grateful for. And when that gratitude turns into a desire to give back to the surroundings and to the whole system, that's exactly what you're saying, and that's exactly what your father is saying. That this becomes our duty, and that becomes our purpose to life.
Yes, so he's deviating a little bit from exactly this topic and actually picking up small points from many discussions we have. I always think that why we are not able to have these kind of conversations with everyone. Means I'm not blaming someone. I am just saying that this was a culture of Bharat to question things. Means our whole culture is based on the tradition of debates, and so this makes me think that where did that attitude go, that we have stopped being curious, we have stopped questioning things, we have started believing things, even believing the books. Means earlier we when we were young we were taught that things written in the book are right, but they not always are. Mm, in science it can be, in other subjects it is not always uh, exactly what is written in the book is right. That
Especially
can be
history.
opinion. Yes, especially history, and not only in the case of India, it's everywhere. So I always wonder that why are people becoming less curious, why people are not trying to take stand for their own thoughts, why are they believing on things that others are telling them. And you see this is the reason why things go viral. We have this attention span of 140 characters. So so things go viral because of that, because if I see something and I find it to be interesting, or if I subconsciously, if I think that okay, if I share this, then this is going to bring me attention, then we share it instantly. And that's how things go viral, and we don't question it, we don't try to verify it. And now government has to teach people that how should you identify fake news with means differentiate fake news with the real news. So this again is as I said, this again is a big pandemic, because the whole system, the whole propaganda, the business is running on that, and we have become a commodity of that business. We are being used by them. So
Correct.
that's one point.
That's absolutely true. Because when you stop thinking for yourself and when you stop asking the right questions, somebody else begins thinking for you. Simple thing that you mentioned, which is the algorithms decide what news is marked as correct and what's flagged as fake. And so we have given up our reasoning faculty, and therefore we allow other people to determine what's right and wrong for us. And that's a big problem. And one of the reasons is that our life has become so busy, not with important things, but just with a lot of things. Today, I actually thought about this a few months ago, that usually when you speak about Vairagya, you talk about giving up many things. And then I realized that I'm very okay giving up a lot of stuff around me. But then there are folders on your computer, and there are files, and there might be songs, there might be videos, and a lot of things that you might be doing. And those keep adding on and on and on. And in a way, it is a form of, occupying your attention. And even besides that, if you look at the way our ancestors lived, take somebody even today in a simple village, a farmer who wakes up in the morning. Now they found that there is something called seasons. Based on certain seasons, certain crops grow better. So they are suited to certain seasons. In summer, certain crops in winter. That way they figure things out. And then they looked at the skies and they found that there is a correlation between the way seasons work and the position of the stars. And then the place where the sun rises and when the sun sets changes from month to month, from day to day. And so they marked all of these things. And based on their curious nature, they came up with so many developments in mathematics, in astronomy, in cosmology, even in Jyotisha Shastra, all of this. And what they were doing was they were creating a map of the world. They were creating a model of the way the world works. And somehow it applied not only to agriculture, but it applied to your Janm Kundli, it applied to your marriage, it applied to so many things. Just a few things that you've discovered are having such widespread applications. And today, because we are just fed things into our systems, and you just read these 140 character Twitter feeds, our attention span has become inversely proportional to the length of a post. The longer something is, the less likes it is going to generate, because people just give up after a certain point. Even when I've posted certain articles, you can check, you can do these analytics and figure out like how far people have read. And if it's a 10-minute post, the average reading time is about 1 minute, and then people give up. So this is a problem. And we've developed, in some sense, as a community, as a society, ADD. It's a serious deficit of attention. And the only way this comes about is because you are literally bombarded with a billion things that you can pursue in your life, and you've lost focus on those few things that actually matter. And a lot of people praise themselves saying that, oh, I'm very good at multitasking. But actually, multitasking is one of the worst things that you can do, because it really takes away your ability to focus and focus on things that actually matter.
So how I think about how I perceive it, as I have been an engineering student, I always talk about efficiency in the terms of efficiency. So when you are multitasking, the efficiency is gone, and means those people who can't do it can try it themselves. That try, uh, for example, when I'm trying to write a research article or a paper, means if I'm sitting for 2 hours, I am writing it or typing it efficiently for not more than half an hour. Other 1.5 hour, but the other 1.5 hour, I'm either trying to get my concentration back to my writing, get my wandering mind from going elsewhere to exactly the point which I have to write, get away from the smartphone notifications which I am getting. So that is happening, and this makes me think that my efficiency has decreased a lot, because till class 10th I did not used to study more than one and a half hour every day. Means I saw students used to study 6 or 7 hours even at that time, but that was good, and at that time my schedule was good, everything was great. But now it's difficult to get back to it, and it gets even difficult because the people around you are working in coherence to that system. They are not ready to decide times for meetings or something like that, because their own life is not scheduled. So they will do at any time they are free, and everyone has to adjust their own schedule according to that. And if you have a schedule, then it becomes a problem. And after work from home, it has been getting more difficult. And about the point, you were saying that how we have a tendency to collect things that which we don't need. So even I know this, but still I have a habit of this, of collecting music files, PDFs. Means I have hundreds of PDFs saved in my laptop, but I rarely go through them. And with this, I think that, see, when we were younger, we did not have phones in our hands. We did not have so many PDFs on the same topic. We did not have access to it. So if we had a question, we had to go through a complete book to understand it. Means anyhow we have to understand it, and it took us 5 to 6 days minimum, but there was an efficiency involved in it. You learned so many things around it. But nowadays you can just Google it out, see the definition. You don't even care whether the first definition which comes in your feed is right or wrong. You don't care about it. You just read it and let it be. And that's another issue, 140 characters attention span, that the people nowadays are not ready to read. They are not ready to read, and they are not able to read as well. And that makes me think that how will I personally will ask my kids to read book in future. Because I know that when, means I have learned it, that when do I need to read a book, and when a Google search will do. But they don't know it. They will have mobile phones in their hands since they are born, and they will be having access to information since day one. So that, I worry about that. I worry a lot. I think a lot about that. That how will I make people study, read?
There is a lot to worry about it, and this also connects back to that master discussion that we had. I call it a master discussion because it covered all of these things really in one single talk, which is why we are doing what we are doing right now, this conversation, this long form of a podcast or a webcast. And again, like just as you spoke about that 140 characters limit, it juxtaposes very well to the Arnab Goswami's show, where everybody has only 140 characters to speak, and then it moves on to somebody else. And because you have so few moments to express your thoughts, and because you're competing with so many other people to share that limited span of time that's allocated to you, you cannot but say something which is very stupid and puerile. Whereas if we have these long, fleshed out discussions without this looming, arrow of time that's going to come to a halt, or somebody's going to ring the bell saying, "Chalo bhai, aapka ek ghanta ho gaya," and therefore you are more capable of developing ideas further. And you often find that when 2 people, 3 people are conversing, after a point it becomes too many, but I would say 2 or 3 people is ideal. Then you discover that there are certain thoughts that you had which you yourself were not aware of, and you begin making these connections because you have somebody else to bounce these ideas off of. And therefore what we are doing, I think, through this initiative and through similar initiatives that we will be having in the future is to orient people to the idea that you cannot fit in life and understand life through a limited set of characters. You need to make deeper explorations. You need to use reasoning. You need to connect disparate topics together, because what appears separated at this moment are really unified at a certain level. And therefore, that holistic vision and holistic understanding of the workings and nuances of life only come through when what you hinted at earlier is we go back to our ancient tradition of debates and dialectics. And I would not say casting doubt on things, but rather asking the right questions. Because sometimes being too doubtful and being too untrusting as a person can also create a problem for one. But once we recognize that we are faced with a certain situation and there is a certain conclusion that has been presented to us, we should approach it with the intention to understand how that conclusion was arrived at, as opposed to blindly accepting it. But at the same time, we have to also approach it with the openness that I am open to the fact that my prior conclusions about this conclusion could be wrong. And it's almost like an update statement in your logic. So if you have an update loop, you're updating your knowledge constantly with new encounters and new inputs from the environment. And then you use that to inform your next decision.
Uh, right. So, as you rightly mentioned about the discussions, so I like to put in an example here. So yes, we listen about group discussions and such things when we talk about the management entrance exams or their syllabuses. But as I have been a student of urban planning, so while I was pursuing my masters, luckily we got the chance to work on live projects. Means whatever we are doing as our studio projects, whatever master plans or regional plans we have been making, that those will be modified a bit, and those will be applied at the locations which we were working on. So for that we actually was required to discuss things. And what I observed was, what happens when, means in urban planning you have to take care of each and everything in that is there in the urban framework, right? So what happens is you have to focus on economy, the sociology, the geography and topography of the area, the demography of that area, all those things, traditions and cultures, how the business is going on, what the people think about their city. So when you start thinking holistically, it takes a lots of time and lots of energy to do that. And we always went to our studios thinking that okay, we have this discussion for this particular objective, and we are going to finish it in 1 hour, and that used to continue for 4 or 5 hours. And you see, every half an hour we got a new insight, and then we got a new pro and con of that. Then we have to work on both, that how to solve the challenges and how to work on our strengths. It kept on going, and it was a really difficult process to reach up to a common conclusion. But it taught me one thing, that there's no option to it. I really think that I don't know how my juniors are doing now amid this pandemic. They are not able to have discussions like we used to have. Means we literally used to sit here and there. Means someone is sitting on ground, someone is sitting on chair, someone is sitting on table, and we are having discussion and we are eating simultaneously. That that is incredible. You learn a lot of things from it. But since I was in that subject, I learned it. Well, people don't get a chance to learn it, and that makes means that gives me an idea that we should make small kids do it. They can have a discussion on anything. Means they can even have a discussion on deciding a common time when they have to reach school, something like that, as easy as that. But that will stimulate their thinking process. That
Yeah.
will make them uh, understand how to perceive things in a holistic manner. They will It will make them make their analytical skills better. So this is a uh, very I would say nice idea which should be applied on each and every level. To I think this is a very nice way to solve the issues and challenges going on in the, especially in the minds of the people.
It's very true. And that's an excellent point that even as children, when you come together and discuss with other kids, it doesn't have to be a profound subject. You know, as a child, I used to watch Dragon Ball Z. You can even discuss somebody's power levels, like who's stronger than the other character, and even have such like logical discussions and be like, oh, but in this episode this guy was able to defeat that other person, therefore he is stronger, but no, in that other episode this guy was stronger, and so on and so forth. And that actually creates these connections in your mind, and then when you grow up you can actually use these connections to arrive at other more important subject matters. And you know, even in our shastras, in Shubhashitams, it is said that one fourth of your learning comes from the teacher, one fourth of it comes from your fellow students, one fourth of it comes through hard work, and one fourth of it comes through time and experience. And so that is the way to really complete your entire learning process. You learn from your teacher, yes, but then you also have to discuss as a group, yes, because that's coming from other friends. You're also learning through your own perseverance, your hard work, your patience, your dedication, all of these things. And then some of it will just come to you in time as you keep it up. Because as you get older, as you get wiser, hopefully, it's not always coinciding, but hopefully, then wisdom will ultimately dawn. And so, yes, you do bring up a very pertinent point.
Right. So, means, you know, means these points I think are not only dependent on the teachers or the policies. Somewhere that this again goes to how the students think, and how the students think depends on how the parents think. So when I was in class 10th, again 2010, that's when CCE pattern of CBSE came up. So that was something co-curricular evaluation or something like that. Means whatever we are doing, everything was going to get evaluated. So I saw that for first few years, first 2 or 3 years, every school implemented it somehow, and then it again vanished somewhere. So what happened in our class was we were really mischievous, but at the same time studious students. So the means you can arrange the people rank wise with respect to their marks or something, and the higher the marks the student is getting, high more the mischievous the student is. So that's how the structure of our class was. Means here I want to point out that I love my class 10 because those people have made me learn a lot of things. So getting back to the point. So what we used to do is we were really competitive. As you said, it was a healthy competition. We used to organize quizzes ourselves. We used to uh, means organize many activities among ourselves. It was, be it academic, be it not academic. We used to play word games on class board, and we used to ask teacher that we are going to do this. You evaluate based on this because you are not able to devise a game. So we are suggesting a game, we are devising a game, and you can mark us based on this. So that was our decision making ability, which developed due to various reasons. I still live in a small township kind of area. So here people means I can roam around at 12 at night, and I am not afraid because everyone around knows me and I know everyone. I can go to anyone's house without calling them once. I can go to my friend's house, they will offer me dinner and I can sleep there. That's not an issue here. So that made me realize how important the society and social bonding is, because now I am not able to uh, I don't feel good in urban areas where I don't know people. When wherever I am going, I have to face new kind of people, new faces whom I cannot emotionally connect to. So uh, means I wonder what it would have been to live in a village. Of course, when I say that, I am ignoring the point of getting all the infrastructural facilities that I am getting here, but I don't think that is a much difficult job for the government to do. But yes, when I say that, I always wonder that what it is like to live in a joint happy family, what it is like to live in a village where everyone knows you, whether everyone where everyone works collectively to build a person up, where every single person is there to motivate you, not bring you down. So that means when I think of an ideal society, I think of that at a nice place, everyone you are interacting with, you know them, they are there to motivate you, not bring you down. And that's how uh, means then you are working as a team, right, towards a shared goal. So that's what is required. And that makes me think that, this integration point which I had started with, so this thing goes now everywhere. It goes on a personal level, that's all right, that we already mentioned. That goes into each kind of system, you see, employees versus bosses, students versus teachers, citizens versus administrators. But ideally it should not be like that. Means administrators are not another person, they are someone from among you. You have appointed them collectively to work for you and not for you. You all are working towards a shared goal. I said this in college as well, that teachers are not against students, we are working towards a shared goal. So that logic or that understanding has to be brought in people.
True. And so what you say about administrators, Chanakya says that administrators should be invisible. You shouldn't even know that they are there. They are simply doing their job, and there's no interference between civil society, administrators, so on and so forth. In fact, ideally speaking, whether it's in a corporation or it's in the government or wherever, when a person is doing the job that they are supposed to do, they're almost invisible. They don't come in the radar, they don't come in the public's eye. The system just continues to flow, just the way that the wind flows, and the sun heats up the wind, and you don't see that process. You know it's happening. And coming to this thing about infrastructure in villages, it might appear as a challenge at first, but I would say because you have so much more free time and so few distractions in the village, some of these things actually can occupy your mind in a good way. If you have to go and get some water maybe from a well, or if it can give you some exercise. Today in our urban society, we live such sedentary lifestyles. Look at where I'm sitting. In ancient days you don't have these things, and so you now we go to the gym to get a workout. In ancient societies or villages, people will be like, what is a gym? Why do you need a gym when I just have to go and bathe in the river? It's already a 2 mile walk. So that way your exercise also is taken care of, your day-to-day routine is taken care of. You don't have to decide what to do today because your day is already planned for you. You know that these are the things to be done, and you do them, and you're very happy about it, and you get nice vitamin D, and you're doing well in life. So that villages life is less it's more carefree, because they don't have so many impinging distractions and social obligations that we do in the city. Also, that point that you raised, that today you can just go to your friend's place and stay over and eat dinner, and you don't have to announce yourself. It was very different for me because I grew up in Mumbai, and I had relatives even in my own building. I would have to take an appointment before going to that place. So it was extremely uncomfortable because the word atithi, you say atithi devo bhava. Tithi means a time. Atithi means that who comes without a tithi, who comes unannounced, without any timing whatsoever. So an unscheduled visitor is called atithi. And an unscheduled visitor you are supposed to treat as Ishvara, and you're supposed to wash their feet when they enter your place. See, today also when my teachers, when they come to our place, before they enter my home, I will go out with a copper vessel and I will wash their feet. And then I will wipe their feet and then I'll invite them in. But now imagine if I do this to our modern Indians, they'll think I'm crazy. But this is our sabhyata, this is our samskara that we are supposed to be following, but we've given it up. And when I used to go back to Mumbai during my vacations, after I took to the teachings of Shastra very seriously, I would go to the mandir wearing a dhoti, and everybody would look at me like I'm some sort of an alien species. It's almost like I don't belong over there, and they will look at you like you are an untouchable of sorts. So these things are not very good because we've given up that simple, harmonious life where you are going back to your roots, you're going back to Mother Nature, and unless you're wearing the suited, booted outfit, and you interact in a certain sociable manner, people don't treat you very well. in urban cities. At least I speak of the experience of Mumbai. I'm sure it's the same in Delhi, Bangalore, other places also.
Yes, so I'll like to take up from the point of wearing dhoti, because you see, there's a whole narrative that how women look good in traditional attire, and you see how every sarkari office needs the women working there to wear suit, but at the same time, it doesn't have any such rules for men, because it has set up so strongly in the minds of administrators as well as people that the formal attire for women is a traditional attire and the formal attire for men is the western attire. And at the same time, people forget that the attire for every location evolved based on the climatic conditions, the geographical conditions of that location. Dhoti and sari in India are very good, but dhoti and sari in Europe, you won't be able to handle that probably. And coat and suit in Europe will probably be much better than coat and suit in India. So that's another thing which arises because of the obviously the inferiority complex going on in the minds of the Indian. And here I like to take it to another point of how the narratives are set. So I have this friend who wears traditional attire, who keeps a shikha, and then one of my roommate met him for the first time. She did not talk much, but afterwards she tells me that she is afraid of such people. I asked, what is there to be afraid of that? She said she is afraid of people in such attire. So the attire was, that particular attire was a orange kurta, a pajama, and a shikha and a tilak. That's it. And the person is not even like uh, very strongly built up or something like that that one should get afraid of. And I was amazed that how can you be afraid of him? So I was thinking that this is how the whole narrative has been set up within the minds of people, especially the people living in urban areas, that such people are dangerous or maybe not civilized enough, something like that. And that's sad. And here, as people are listening this, I like to mention that boys really look good in the traditional attire of India. Means they really really look good in it. I don't know why they don't prefer it. Somewhere in some institutions they do, and it's nice, but I think they should go back to it.
No, that's a very fair point. And what you're saying is a very basic rule in architecture, that form follows function. And very true that, why should you dress outside of your climatic conditions in an attire which is unsuited for that? And even to your point about someone looking good in a certain outfit versus others, what you are saying would be deemed as highly inappropriate by certain postmodernist circles, because you have introduced an objectivity in terms of standards of beauty. And I think that's a topic that's worth getting into, because nowadays there's this movement which suggests that everything is equally beautiful, everything is equally true. There are no such things as objective standards. Everything is only subjective. There is no such thing as an ideal frame or an ideal weight. And sure, we can agree that there's not an ideal weight in a given kg basis, but there is at least a range within which one can say this is healthy, this is fit, and there's a range outside of which one can definitely see that there is something unhealthy, unfit, unappealing, unaesthetic about it. So in the US, and this has also entered India, as one can tell, there is something called the anti-fat shaming movement. And so what you see is that there are posters, magazine covers, all of these things, where you'll have like some female who's, I don't know, maybe 75, 80 kgs, and she'll be modeling in a very skimpy bathing suit or some very exposed attire. Now, they say that why should we call ourselves any less beautiful than somebody who is better toned or fitter than us? And there's an entire movement, especially the feminist movement, that is backing this idea. So, your thoughts on that? Because I think it's absurd.
Uh, See, means it's about perspective. Yes, everything is beautiful because everything is a product of nature, but exactly at the point when you start working against the nature, it doesn't remain beautiful. Because our conversation on Facebook started on the say similar post I did, which was based on pi or the golden ratio. So for the people who don't know about it, pi is the ratio in which almost all the things in nature are arranged. You see a flower, how the petals are in a spiral, so it is arranged in a pi ratio. You see a conch shell, a shank, so it is arranged in the same ratio. Our galaxies, the ratio of uh, our organs, everything is arranged in that ratio,
Even
and it is
architecture.
even architecture. Yes, the means everything most of the people find beautiful is arranged in the golden ratio, and there are several more mathematical ratios, like there are fractals, there are several other uh, say mathematical formulas or algorithms which can be attributed as beautiful naturally.
Mhm.
So that's about physical beauty. But as I mentioned, whenever you try to move away from the nature, it doesn't remain beautiful, because the nature, certain things evolved to be beautiful. Flowers are meant to be beautiful, to be attractive, so that the plants can disperse their seeds. That's why that is beautiful. And if you don't find it beautiful, then there is some issue with you. So same thing goes with health. You are meant to be in a certain shape and health, and the point when you are deviating with that due to your own say laziness or health issues which can be tackled, uh, in cases when it cannot be tackled, there will be obviously a other kind of take on it. But if it can be tackled and you are not working on it, and it doesn't remain beautiful, means it can be controversial for few people. But if you think about it, it is not, because nature is supposed to be beautiful, and anything that tries to interfere or deviate doesn't remain beautiful anymore.
True. And here, as far as anyone finding it controversial, um, fact doesn't care about your feelings, right? Facts are what they are. There is an objective truth about life. And I sound perhaps a little harsh and a little critical about this issue, is because it has been bombarded onto us by the dominant social narrative that I find myself at least mired in the US, which is the leftist postmodernist narrative which says that there are no objective truths. And so, even let's take an evolutionary approach. Let's talk about the nature aspect of it. Why is it, for example, I was having this conversation with my wife, Unnati, and we were discussing that why is it that a guy would somehow find the 36, 24, 36, oh, I think the,
No, please continue.
oh,
That's fine.
we can
It's a
continue? Okay.
poster. Yes.
I see, it's a poster. So
Hmm.
why would somebody find the 36, 24, 36 ratio appealing on the feminine gender? And the reason is that when you have a certain ratio with respect to the hip, it is also very conducive for childbirth. For example, a female with a very narrow hip would have difficulties in delivering. And so, there's that. And then after the child is born, there's aspects of nursing, which are very important. And so if there is some natural tendency that gears you towards good health, it's again a matter of form following function. And so the feminine form or the masculine form, and we can come back to the masculine form in a moment, but the feminine form over here is basically announcing herself that I am motherly material. And I am fit and I am fertile and I am ready to bear children. And therefore, these are the ratios that men would find attractive in women, because this is again a very evolutionary approach. Same way, if a woman would perceive a man, they would want the person to be muscular, to be strong, to be virile, to be in a capacity where they can bear tensile strength, because this again goes back to our ancestry, that for the most part, men were hunters and gatherers, and women tended to the caves or whatever the local area that they lived in, right? And so women were not meant to be that virile and that physically strong, whereas men had to be that in order for them to outcompete other tribes and other species of animals, and also to forage and to basically be outdoors. And so that it also goes back to this whole argument about in India, for example, we have a very wide climatic set of regions. So if you go up north, it's pretty cold. If you go to northeast, it's extremely rainy. Chirapunji, highest rainfall in the world. If you go to Rajasthan, there's a desert. If you go to south, again, you have like the plains. So there are like different regions and there are different skin tones, there are different climatic conditions. Now, recently there was this whole debate about fair and lovely and dropping the word fair from lovely. And I'm okay with that. Like I don't have a personal preference that somehow a certain skin tone is going to add to the attraction of somebody. But should this discussion come from leftist activist pressure, or should it actually come after a reasoned debate about what it really means? And so my argument is that today, if you live in the US, the blacks who came over here from Africa as slaves, they require vitamin D supplements, and they require vitamin D because they have extra melanin in their skin, and the sunlight in the northern hemisphere is less. Whereas they come from an equatorial zone in Africa where the sunlight was very harsh, so they required more melanin in their skin. Likewise, if a white person in Europe or US would find themselves in Africa, they would get skin burn. So the sunburn would lead to stuff such as skin cancer and other problems. And therefore, there is a climatic zone and there is an associated skin type. So nowadays, and one can argue that in the last few hundred years, there has been an aristocracy that has developed where women generally tended to be indoors more than men. They were not outdoors so much, they were not so much out in the field, so on and so forth. And so that became a mark of wealth, because the more you were capable of being indoors, the wealthier you were perceived as. Whereas if you look at it from the perspective of men, they say tall, dark, and handsome, right? So the dark is supposed to be more of an attribute for men because they were expected to be outdoors and to make to earn their living in the baking sun. So therefore, you have all of these evolutionary and social forces which bring about some objectivity as to what our standards are. And my concern is not that you have dropped a certain word from your product, but the fact that this discussion was not had before you did it. And it came because certain activists pressured you to get it out.
Yes, right. And as you are talking about evolution, I don't exactly remember the name of the book, but it is written by the same author, same two authors who have written the book Why Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus.
Mm.
There's another book by the same writers which goes something like why men cannot look at find things put in front of them and why women can't women keep speaking. There's something like that is the title. So I found that book accidentally in my college library and it was amazing. Means it explains every single thing. Means women keep on pointing certain things that why can't men do this, and there are a range of things which men can't do, and there are a range of things which women can't do. So the debate goes on, and that book so nicely explains that how and why the evolution took place in a certain way, which leads to how men and women differently behave. And as we were talking about the postmodernist approach to it, that everything is beautiful, everything is equal. At certain spiritual level, it is, but not everything is a social construct. There is an intrinsic quality involved in every single organism or a person or a gender. Means every common way in which you can group people, there are certain intrinsic qualities in them. So I also read about the study where there were monkeys, male and female monkeys. They were provided with certain kinds of toys. So the toys were there were some mechanical car like toys, and there were dolls. So initially, all of them were curious, and all of them were playing with all the toys. But after some time, they observed how the female monkeys have moved towards playing with the dolls kind of toys, and the male monkeys have moved towards playing with the mechanical kind of toys.
Right.
So no social construct is involved there. They have been living in a whole natural environment, but still they are doing it. So I always had this confusion that whether it is intrinsic or whether it is not. I always used to think and discuss with people to understand that is it or is it not. But that was enough to prove that there are intrinsic qualities involved and you cannot deny them. And the moment you start denying them, it becomes abnormal. It becomes taking form of something which is not desired in a society or which is not beneficial to the society. So, this postmodernist approach has been denying such points. They are saying that means they are basically trying to make women a man. And
Right.
there's this quotation by Premchand that means men have not evolved up to the range of women. When a man reaches the peak of evolution, he will such kind of what to say, such kind of movement started. But at the same time, what was the situation in India? And now what is the situation in Europe and in India? It has never run parallelly to each other. They have always been very, very different. So while we talk about such topics, I think people should uh, focus on how to solve the issues which are what to say relevant only to India. They should not focus on what's going on in USA and how some random feminist is standing naked on the streets. That is stupidity. That has no validity, and I don't know how is it going to empower women. So we had our own methods, we had our own philosophies and social setups, which are probably lost in people. Obviously, because of colonization and such things, because it hampers uh, with the way people think in a means in a long term duration. It hampers with it. So it has been hampered, and I think people should work on it and think about it like that in such perspectives, that how do we solve the current issues, how do we raise kids who are aware about such issues, how do we not feed our kids the education which is mean to be fed to the kids studying in USA. So that point needs to be taken up by someone, actually everyone.
Right. It's very important indeed. And as you pointed, you cannot look at the symptom and somehow try to cure the cause without identifying what the cause is. So you always have to go back to the root cause of the problem. And so I think it might be worthwhile for me to just frame where I think that the root cause of these problems, not all of them, but a good fraction of them come from. So if you look at our ancient Indian society, Hindu society, Dharmic society, and I basically treat all of these as synonyms because our ancient culture is the Hindu culture, whether people accept it or not. It is a ancient traditional Hindu society which has informed the values and the structure of the country. So in those days, there were examples where it is shown that men and women would bathe together in the lake, and their vastrams would be out on the banks of those rivers. That's why you have the story of Krishna Chor. He would run away with the vastrams, things like that. And so, in those instances, there were not any, from what I could tell and what I could understand, any reports of molestation or misbehavior against the opposite gender, because there was that openness. Now, even if you look at the clothes that women used to wear in those days, we did not have the technology of stitching. So it was one single cloth that was draped, and there was a lot of stuff being exposed as well. Like, a good amount of skin was being shown on the body. And that did not really incite people into quote unquote the rape like behavior or anything that you hear of today in the media. We can come back into the media exaggerations as well. And I think it's worth touching upon that. But just to go back to those points, after the Islamic invasion, this sense of propriety about how women should dress, this whole burqa culture, hijab culture, where if you expose your skin, it's your fault if somebody else is attracted. And so that sense of shame had been imported from the Arabian soil onto the Bharatiya soil. And then thereon, this sense of maryada about how women should dress and how they should not dress became a very important topic. Today, also, if you go to southern India, it is a little less impacted by the Mughal invasion than northern India. And so one of my friends who's Tamil, his mother, she had visited a Sikh friend, and the Sikh friend had taken her to a Gurdwara in the north. So the Sikh friend asked her to cover her head with the pallu, because that's what you do, right, when you enter the Gurdwara and all. And this Tamil lady refused to do that. She said, in my Indian Hindu culture, women only cover their heads when the husband is dead. Until then, you will not cover your heads. So this whole thing about like head covering and all was also not our ancient culture. It is actually coming from these people that, okay, somehow women have to show humility and they have to cover their heads, whereas men don't have to show that. And so a lot of these things about women being more, needing to be more humble, needing to be a bit more shy, all of these attributes actually came from the time of invasion. But it got a lot worse also during the British period, because you had this whole Victorian sense of propriety, right? Where again, women were like covered from head to toe and they had to wear that wig and they had to like wear those fancy hats and they had to wear like sleeves which are all the way up to here and ankle length outfits. And so even the Britishers actually discouraged women from showing skin during the 17th, 18th century. And of course, things became a bit more liberal. If you just go back to the evolution of the swimsuit, even in the US itself, you will see how swimsuits differed from the 1900s to the 2000s. And the earliest swimsuits were like complete like body covers. So therefore, a lot of this shame game really entered into our social psyche after a certain point, but it was not present earlier on. Now, it is true. Just one more point on this whole catcalling business. What has happened today, unfortunately, in our culture, is that men and women are not able to bond with each other without women being told that you are being harassed. Suppose in more ancient times, let's say in the Western culture, if a guy goes to a restaurant or he goes to a bar, he could strike a conversation with a woman and he could show interest. Can I buy you a coffee? Can I do this? Can I do that? Today, that will be seen as sexual advances. That, oh, how dare you approach me? You know, you're harassing me. I never asked you to come into my space. But imagine that if you take away that component, how will you establish courtship? Especially in a society where you don't have arranged marriages in the West. How can a guy approach a woman without being said that you're harassing me? How can he even try to flirt with her without saying that, okay, you are troubling me and I'm going to call the cops? So this has become an issue, and there are very strong evidences that it reflects in the fertility drop in the US. Now, even at the workplace, usually, in earlier 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, couples used to get married at the workplace. Now that's being discouraged because it's a distraction from work, and somehow this whole workplace harassment policy is trying to resist this movement. So in the previous workplace, my manager actually fell for somebody working on his team, and she had to leave uh, for them to continue on. She had to leave it. So they got engaged afterwards, but it was at the sacrifice of her job. So these things are very troubling and very problematic. So when it comes to this catcalling business, some people are just desperate, no doubt about it. Some people are just extremely, uh, low culture. They don't have enough maryada. They don't have enough manners. All of these things. Maybe not a good upbringing. There's that component also. But a component of it is just that, okay, there's an attractive girl, and I feel compelled, just as an evolutionary reaction, to reach out to her and announce that I'm interested in you. And so there could be that innocent aspect of it as well. And it's not always meant to be a harassment. So we have to figure out which one is which and how much of it is just bad behavior and how much of it is innocent. And lastly, just one point on this whole rape culture accusation about India, about Bharat. I've done the statistics on this. The rape incidents in India are 1.8 out of 10,000. In the US, it is 27. That's 15 times higher than India. And in Europe, it is much, much, much higher. Like I think UK is like 40 or 50, and South Africa is like 135, 140 something. That means, imagine that so far in the media, in the American media, in the European media, in the damn Indian secular media, we've constantly been fed this narrative that rapes happen in India. And they do. And I'm not discounting the fact that even a single rape is something to be taken lightly, not at all. But we have to uh, measure proportion, and we have to accept that no matter how clean a society can be, there will always be miscreants. There will always be people who misbehave. There will always be people who are criminal minded. And we have to figure out a way to safeguard our men and women from such miscreants in society. But to say that there's an entire country where there's a pandemic of rapes happening and this constant reportage about it is also inaccurate.
So what I think about it is, it's not means more than the role of media. What has been happening is people have got this tendency to rather whine about things without going into the depth of it. Like someone said that India has the rape culture, and everyone starts saying the same thing. They are not ready to. For example, you found out the statistics, but not everybody does that. I did it, but not everybody does that. So they are not trying to do it. They are saying, means I am saying that they are saying it. I am not saying it. They are saying that India has a rape culture. So what are you personally doing to solve it? Are you doing something, or are you just being a social media activist? Are you trying to even find out the root cause? Because even understanding something uh, makes you subconsciously do many things to solving the issue. So you are not even trying to find out the reasons, you are just crying about it. And as you mentioned about how women were being treated in West versus in Bharat, so yes, it again comes to the point that how women have been perceived in various cultures, or you can say religions. Means I'm not talking about how it is now, I'm going back to the roots again. That if we talk about the religious texts, then how women have been portrayed in each of those religious texts, be it Hindu text, be it Christian, Muslim, any of such texts, how women have been perceived in that. Because the root thought process of a person comes from what the generations has taught them. And if the generations have taught you wrong thing and you are trying to be right, then it is a difficult process. And if the generations have told you the right thing and you are trying to be wrong, then it is also a difficult process. Means shifting from the trends is a difficult process. But if someone has shifted, then bringing them back to it is not a difficult process. So what media has been doing is they are denying the root cause of it. They are just whining about it and crying about that this is happening, this is happening, this is happening. And as soon as you try to point out why is this happening, they just dismiss your logics. They say that no, nothing like that is happening. India is the rape capital. Why is it the rape capital? You are not ready to show us the statistics. You are not ready to show us the. Yes, there are no proofs. We are not ready to show us or discuss about the root causes. I haven't seen any single discussions on any news channel about why is this happening. I have just seen that okay, this is happening, here happened, but nothing in the root of it.
So there's
So
a very
I
sorry.
always yes. So
No, so
whenever I talk to okay, this voice is
after
breaking. Okay, let me
sorry.
continue. Yes. So whenever I talk to students, means the people who are still students, I always ask them to check the thing they just shared. Means just in case, for example, this GDP thing, many were sharing the wrong data because someone published it. So I asked them to check it themselves, that I am giving you the link, Go check what is actually happening, because you are a student. You are not supposed to believe on anything. You are supposed to find, think, research about it, analyze what is happening. You are supposed to infer things from the raw data. You are not supposed to read someone else's analysis or interpretation of it. So yes, you were saying something.
Sorry. Uh, Very
Yes.
good point. That the reason the news is veiling this fact and they dismiss your arguments is because for them to say that somehow this is rooted to some religion or some culture would be denying the fact that um, all religions and all cultures are not equal. They are not. And and here I don't even want to make an argument about inferiority or superiority, though there are arguments to be made about that. Let's be very clear on that also, that there are certainly certain cultures which are better suited for growth, for overall prosperity, happiness, spiritual, adhyatmic, all of these things. There are certain cultures better suited, no doubt about it. But to point out that the root cause is in certain religions would be denying that narrative that the media is trying to basically push away. And it would go against their paymasters, the people who are promoting all of these things. Now, even if you look at Sanatana Dharma, it is the only living tradition in the world where the feminine is worshipped as a devi and the masculine is worshipped as a deva, and the Napunsak is also worshipped. That's why you have Ardhanarishwara in the form of Dakshinamurti or Shiva. So, half masculine, half feminine. And then when you refer to Brahman, Paramananda Brahma, uh, it is Napunsaklinga, because that is where both the masculine and feminine collapse into the core ground reality, which is the absolute reality. And so therefore we have accommodated all of these things very beautifully, and we have accorded respect to every single possible sex that there is. And here's the mistake that the West has made, unfortunately. But okay, I'll come back to that in a moment. But if you look at Islam, for instance, it actually speaks of women as trading them as property. You can trade women as you can trade property. And of course, there's this hijab and stoning women and all of those things. The Bible says that if on your wedding night you discover that your wife is not a virgin, you must take her to her father's doorstep and crush her skull with a stone on the father's doorstep. That's what the Bible says. Now, somebody may want to deny this, and they are welcome to deny it, but it's there in the scriptures. And one can easily argue that what is there in the scriptures, and when a society follows those scriptures diligently for X number of centuries, it becomes part of their social fabric, those norms and those ethical injunctions. And that's how you have this Victorian morality. And that's how you have this Islamic thing about hijab. Only 7 or 8 or 5 years ago, Saudi Arabia allowed people to drive, women to drive. They issued license to women only this last decade. And there are so many draconian laws over there. And so that is what differentiates. If you look at Bharat even today, we, in spite of all the challenges we face, which is pretty much the topic of our discussion, we are low on resources. We are overpopulated. We are still growing past this colonial baggage that we've carried. We've been deprived of a very fantastic GDP growth that we had before the Mughal era and before the colonial British era. And we are trying to recover from all of it. And yet, on the whole, I think we are doing okay. We are not as bad as projected by people, as projected by certain institutions, as projected by the media, as projected by uninformed Indians themselves. And there is so much more growth left, no doubt about it. But if we begin to curse ourselves as Bharatiyas, saying that our nation is fraught with issues and there is nothing worthwhile that we have over here, we have actually divorced ourselves from a very rich and ancient heritage that our ancestors have bequeathed upon us. And therefore, my suggestion to all viewers also would be that take what you have, explore into your own past, explore present theories, try to meld them together, study urban development, study theology, study philosophy, study sciences, not social sciences, because I don't regard them as science at all. And learn as much as you can about life and try to integrate these things together, because only a holistic set of understandings will propel you and prepare you for the future.
Right. So, as you rightly mentioned, that how we are in a process of recovery and how we are doing good in it. So yes, I was actually going to conclude with that point that yes, we were facing a lot of things for generations, and that still is somewhere in the minds of every single one among us. And but at the same time, we should also be aware that it has taken centuries to bring us here. But I don't think it will take more than a few decades if we start working to bring us out of it. And as you were talking about what different religious texts mention about women, uh, I'd say that rather let the people who are rather let the audience find it out themselves, because I don't think anything more is required to make them curious to read those things. These all read all the scriptures of various religions, and it is not a very big deal nowadays. You can get everything on internet. You have PDFs. You have verified kind of documents which have been verified by their supreme religious authorities. So it can be done. And with that, I think we should end this particular conversation now and continue in some other one.
Definitely, and I think we have many topics left unexplored. So postmodernism is one thing that we could discuss. We spoke to a good degree about free will, about the Jagat, about how it came about. We spoke about so many other things prior, and I think each of these can take up a separate topic, including childhood upbringing, dive deeper into the impacts of social media, about helicopter parenting, so on and so forth. So yeah, let's continue this dialogue. And for now, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I think it's seeded a lot more that I can think of. So I'll just close off on Shanti Mantra, or perhaps you would, if you could close off on a mantra since I started on one.
No, no, you please continue.
Okay. Om Purnamadah Purnamidam Purnaat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha Hari Om Namaste.
Namaste. Uh, Stop streaming it, maybe.